Hey guys, tonight we're stepping barefoot into a muddy field just outside a medieval village. The sun's barely up, but your back's already slick with sweat, and your hands ache from harvesting barley, the old-fashioned way, sickle sack and sore shoulders. Chickens peck around your feet, unconcerned that today is no ordinary workday. It's tax day. You know this because the reeve, the Lord's steward, just rode past on a creaky horse calling your name without looking at you. That means you have a few hours to deliver your dues to the manor's granary, or tomorrow you might be fined extra. Or worse, your best ox might mysteriously go missing. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge toward the barn sack over shoulder, heart heavier than the grain it carries. This isn't some corrupt government fee. This is your feudal obligation, your rent, your duty, your reality. In the Middle Ages, land doesn't come cheap. Or rather, it comes cheap, but the strings attached are thick and itchy. You don't pay in coins, you pay in crops. Wheat, oats, barley, and rye, plus whatever else your Lord demands. The best part, you have no control over how much he asks for. The granary looms like a judgmental beast, half wood, half thatch, fully hungry. The reeve stands in front with a wax tablet noting how much each peasant delivers. Some try to stuff their sacks with stones underneath the grain. Others mix in spoiled barley. You don't. Not because you're honest, but because your cousin tried that last year and spent a week digging latrines with a broken shovel. Your share today is 1/4. That's roughly 210 liters of grain. You grew it, harvested it, threshed it, and now you're giving it away. Your kids ask why. You tell them the same thing your father told you. Because the land isn't ours. It's his. This is the essence of medieval taxation for a villain, a peasant, tied to the land. The Lord lets you live and farm on his estate, and in return, you owe him a portion of what the land produces. No matter how hungry your family is, those sacks go to the barn first. You can eat what's left. Historians still argue whether this arrangement was exploitative serfdom or just a harsh but functioning system for the time. Some point out that peasants got protection and justice in return. Others say that's like calling a cage a cozy room with free walls. The reeve nods at your delivery, but doesn't thank you. Gratitude is a luxury reserved for lords and saints. Instead, he scratches a line next to your name and jerks his thumb at the next peasant. You watch as Old Wolf stumbles up with a sack that smells faintly of mushrooms and regret. The barn itself tells its own story. Rows of earthen pots, sacks stacked high, rats lurking in shadows, and each stack represents a family's sacrifice. No one complains, at least not loudly. The last guy who did had his firewood reallocated to the Lord's kitchen and spent winter in a hut so cold even the fleas wore cloaks. There's something oddly ritualistic about it. You come, you bow, you offer grain, and you leave with less than you had, but more than nothing. You mumble a prayer to whichever saint handles grain rot and hope your next harvest is kinder. It's not just grain either. Sometimes you're expected to deliver ale honey eggs or even beeswax. The obligations vary from manor to manor. One nearby village had to deliver a barrel of eel each Michaelmas. Eels, every year. Nobody knows why. Probably someone owed a favor to a bishop with a slippery palate. And there's no negotiation. If you can't pay in crops, you pay in labor. Can't pay in labor. The reeve starts looking at your tools, your cart, maybe even your daughter's loom. One way or another, the Lord gets his due. You step back from the barn and let out a breath you didn't realize you were holding. The air smells like damp straw and resignation. You've paid for her now. But the cycle never ends. Every spring, every harvest, the barn waits. So does the reeve. So does the system. And you go back to your patch of earth, rub your blistered hands and keep digging, because the land isn't yours. But the hunger in your belly definitely is. You hear it before you see it, the gentle bleating of a goat tied to a cart that smells like every stable you've ever worked in. Your neighbor Edith is trudging beside it, gripping the reins with one hand and a basket of eggs in the other. She's dressed in her best shawl, which still smells faintly of cabbage stew. She's not going to church. She's going to pay her rent with livestock. You wave as she passes, and she gives you a look that says, "Pray this works." Because in this part of the countryside, where coin is rare and trust even rarer, taxes often look less like ledgers and more like petting zoos. Chickens, goats, even ducks. Anything with feathers, fur, or a heartbeat has at some point been handed over to settle a debt. The system, if you can call it that, is laughably inconsistent. One week, the reeve might accept 6 hens and call it fair. The next, he demands a piglet or 2, or maybe a nice, fat goose. Edith's hoping the goat and the eggs will be enough to cover her overdue field rent, and that tiny incident with her son poaching rabbits. You don't ask how she got the goat. You do, however, silently admire her gamble. That goat is fatter than most, and those eggs still have hay stuck to them, fresh, impressive. Historians still debate how much of medieval taxation was formally documented versus just negotiated through barter and social pressure. Some manorial records are precise. Others list vague entries like a gesture of goodwill. You suspect gesture sometimes involved mead. You remember your own dealings last winter when the frost came early and your cabbage crop died. You had no grain to give. So you marched up with a side of smoked venison, technically poached, and a barrel of sour ale. The reeve stared for a long time, then shrugged. "It'll warm someone's bones," he said, before waving you off. No official receipt, just a nod, and your name stayed out of the fine ledger for another month. There's a subtle theater to these transactions. Everyone pretends it's a system, but deep down, it's personal. The reeve likes cheese. Your cow better be generous. The Lord's wife favors woven cloth. Guess who's dusting off her loom? Taxes in the Middle Ages are as much about relationships as they are about value. Edith returns, without the goat or the eggs, but with a loaf of dark rye under her arm. A thank you gift, she says from the cook at the manor. The goat, apparently, has already made friends with the Lord's hounds. You ask if she's paid off her rent. She shrugs. Maybe. Until Michaelmas. And then there are the prayers. Oh, the prayers. Because no one, not even the most seasoned barterer, walks into a tax negotiation without invoking at least one saint. St. Matthew for money. St. Lawrence for cooking oddly useful if your offering is edible. And St. Expeditus for expediency. You don't know if the saints actually care, but muttering their names gives you something to do while you wait for judgment. Quirky tax practices pop up everywhere. In a village 2 hills over, folks used to pay part of their rent in bees, real living bees. The manor kept hives and made mead, and peasants were expected to bring swarms in baskets. Imagine showing up to the tax barn, buzzing like a threat. That tradition ended after one particularly chaotic year involving a broken basket, a clumsy boy in a reeve with a now famous fear of anything that buzzes. The truth is, you'd trade almost anything to avoid paying in actual labor, because labor means days away from your own work under the eye of a bailiff who thinks shouting is a leadership skill. So, yes, you'll hand over the goat, or the eggs, or the bees. Just don't send you to dig drainage ditches during planting season. Still, the line between tax and offering is blurred. The Lord's table is often filled with peasant goods, bread, cheese, fruit, and no one calls it theft. It's rent duty custom, and heaven help you if you try to explain to your children why the jam they made for Easter ended up on the steward's breakfast tray. And let's not forget the just-in-case gifts. A plump apple, a ribbon, a song. Sometimes people offer small tokens that aren't required, hoping for future leniency. You once saw a boy recite a rhyme about turnips that made the entire barn laugh. The reeve gave his family an extra day to pay. You've since tried singing yourself. No dice, so you do what everyone else does. You improvise, you trade, you over-deliver when you can, and pray for mercy when you can't. Because in this world, taxes aren't just numbers, they're relationships, performances, a gamble, and a hope. And when the goat's gone and the eggs are cracked, you go home, pour the last of your cider, and wonder if St. Expeditus ever paid taxes himself. It's Sunday morning, and instead of sleeping in, or rather, instead of doing the exact same chores but in your second-best tunic, you're trudging toward the village church with a sack of turnips, a bottle of honey, and a sheepish expression. Because today is not about sin or salvation. Today is Tithe Day, and that means giving 1/10 of everything you produce to God's local representatives on earth. 1/10, a tithe. It sounds clean and mathematical until you're trying to figure out if that includes the 5 onions your wife hid in the root cellar or the half loaf of bread that's already missing a suspicious bite. The priest doesn't care. The tallyman doesn't care. 10% means 10%. Yes, even of your beeswax, especially your beeswax. You shuffle into the churchyard and place your offerings near the others. There's a neat little pile of barley, some jars of pickled fish, a bundle of flax, and bafflingly a pair of hand-knit socks that still smell like wet feet. Someone's clearly run out of ideas. You hope God likes socks. Tithes are one of those taxes dressed up in religion. They don't come from a lord. They come from Scripture. Or, at least, that's what the priest says every time someone grumbles. Give unto the Lord what is the Lord's, he says, with the practiced tone of someone who's been quoting that since he was 12. You wonder if he had to tithe 10% of his childhood chores, too. Historians still argue whether the tithe was truly mandatory across all regions or more of a social expectation, backed by peer pressure and moral dread. What's clear is that everyone paid, if not in goods, then in guilt. And this isn't a one-time thing. Tithes are due regularly. Some places collect weekly, others quarterly. Some are stricter, requiring first fruits, literally the first apples, off your tree. If a pig gives birth to 10 piglets, you best hope the 10th one isn't your favorite because off it goes to the vicarage. It's not just food. Wool eggs, cheese, sometimes even soap. Anything you produce a slice goes to the church. And if you think you can get away with under-declaring your yield, think again. The church has ears and eyes. And that one guy named Thomas, who always seems to be just passing by when you're hauling sacks into your cellar at dusk. You've heard tales of people being cursed for holding back their tithe. One poor soul, 2 villages over, allegedly lied about his oat yield and found his cows all mysteriously limping the next morning. Was it divine punishment, bad hay, or just the priest sneaking into the pasture and poking hooves with sticks? You'll never know. But the cows walked funny for a week, and everyone paid their dues on time after that. The priest himself doesn't usually collect it. No, that job falls to the glebe steward, a man who has memorized how many chickens you had last spring and isn't afraid to ask why there are fewer this year. You once saw him smell a pot of butter to determine if it was fresh. His nose wrinkled. The widow who brought it never missed another tithe again. You may be wondering, where does it all go? The grain is stored. The eggs get eaten. The beeswax lights the altar candles, or depending on the season, the bishop's guest chamber. Some of it is supposed to be redistributed to the poor, which sounds noble, except no one quite knows who the poor are in a village where everyone has holes in their shoes. You've also heard of tithes being sent to faraway abbeys, or worse, to Rome. One day you were told your honey might sweeten a bishop's tea halfway across the continent. Somehow that doesn't make you feel better. And then there are special tithes, Peter's pence Lent offerings, Easter dues, just when you think you've paid everything, another collection basket shows up, sometimes literally during Mass. You once saw a woman whisper her confession while slipping a cheese wheel under the pew. The priest nodded solemnly, as if forgiveness now came with dairy. One of the more bizarre quirks, death tithes. When someone dies, a portion of their belongings is given to the church. Even in death, you're taxed. Your old boots, your cloak, even your best spoon might end up in the rectory drawer. If you're lucky, the priest uses it. If not, it gets sold to buy new candle wicks or choir books. But for all the grumbling, you still go. You bring your sack of produce. You nod to the steward. You mumble your prayers. And sometimes in the stillness of the chapel, with dust dancing in the light through stained glass, and the scent of beeswax thick in the air, you feel something. A moment of peace. Maybe that's worth a turnip or two. Still, as you walk home, sack lighter, heart heavier, you can't help but think, if God really wanted your onions, couldn't he just grow his own? You're staring at your hands, rough cracked and permanently dusted with flour and earth, because those hands are your currency. You've got no coin, and if you did, it would probably already be in the Reeves pouch or melted into a chalice on the altar. So instead you pay with what you have, things you've grown, built, spun, carved, dug up, or somehow made out of mud, sweat, and mild desperation. No coins. No problem. Welcome to the glorious world of payment in kind, where butter bundles of firewood, or even that oddly shaped turnip from last spring, could be worth something if the steward's in a generous mood. Today you're bringing cloth, rough wool dyed poorly with onion skins, and a prayer, but it's sturdy and warm, and just maybe enough to cover your obligation for that new corner of field you've been allowed to till. You tie it up with a bit of twine and hope no one notices the part with the snag from where your goat chewed on it. The clerk at the manor gate barely looks at it. He scribbles something on his wax tablet and motions for the next peasant, who's carrying a basket of hazelnuts and dried mushrooms. Behind him, a woman drags a bucket full of lamp oil. No two offerings are alike. That's the point. In a world where minted coins are mostly reserved for merchants, bishops, or people with suspiciously few blisters, the peasantry invents its own economy out of whatever the land can spare. Historians still debate how widespread coin use actually was in rural medieval life. Minting increased during certain reigns, and towns had markets where coins flowed more freely. But out here in the manors, where fields stretch longer than your patience, coin is a rumor. A silver penny is rarer than a kind reeve, and just as likely to disappear. Even when coinage is technically required, like when paying royal taxes or market tolls, you often find a middleman to convert your goods into cash. That usually means selling your best honey fish or wool to a merchant who underpays you and overcharges everyone else. You've done it before, you'll do it again. Because if the king wants silver, he doesn't want excuses. But most local dues can be settled in kind. The system is elastic, if maddening. One day your bundle of garlic is worth 2 days' rent. The next, it's not fresh enough, and you're told to bring firewood instead. So you go home, chop down half a tree, and hope no one counts the rings. And let's not forget labor as payment. When you have neither goods nor coin, the steward puts your body on the ledger. You'll be sent to dig ditches, repair fences, haul stones, thresh grain, not for your own fields, of course, but for the Lord's, sometimes for the church, once hilariously for a noble's pig who needed a new mud wallow. You remember that summer vividly. It was hot, the tools were bent, and the pig had a personality. Every time you tried to dig, he'd snort and roll onto your foot. You finished 3 days late and had to deliver 2 cabbages just to avoid further punishment. The pig naturally remained unimpressed. There's a sort of grim beauty to the chaos. It's a barter economy run on intuition, suspicion, and the occasional bribe. If the steward likes you, your half-rotten apples might buy you a week's grace. If he doesn't, he might lose your payment record entirely. You once saw a man offer a finely carved wooden flute. The steward stared at it for a long time, then handed it to the priest who played it terribly that Sunday during Mass. Some peasants get creative. A widow named Maud, sharp as a needle and twice as painful, once paid her dues with a basket of blessed herbs. No one asked which saint did the blessing. The steward kept them, and his cough mysteriously vanished. Coincidence? You don't ask. You just nod and admire the hustle. And then there are the communal efforts. If you and your neighbors can't meet a tax as individuals, sometimes you band together. One person provides meat, another eggs, a third spins a blanket. It's a group project with no glory and a guaranteed failing grade if even one part goes wrong, but it can work. You once joined such a scheme and paid off the year's grazing fee for the village pigs who promptly escaped the next day and ate the priest's ornamental cabbages. Still, there's a logic to it all. Everyone owes, everyone pays, and everyone remembers. There's a little tally in everyone's head: who's generous, who cheats, who paid in dried apples last time and still hasn't made it right. It's an unspoken record, more accurate than any scroll. You finish tying your bundle and leave it on the steward's table, glancing at the other offerings. You see wool onions, a bottle of honey, 2 roasted pigeons, and something that looks suspiciously like a carved turnip shaped like the Virgin Mary. You raise an eyebrow. The steward doesn't blink. You walk home lighter, not in wealth, but in obligation, for now. Until next week, or until the steward needs a new pair of boots and decides your sheepskin looks promising. You're kneeling in your garden, pulling weeds, with the focus of a monk transcribing scripture, when you hear it, the unmistakable sound of hooves on packed earth, slow, deliberate, too heavy to be a tradesman, and too rhythmic to be a drunk on a donkey. You freeze. So does your dog, who's halfway through chewing a stick that might have once been part of your roof. Then you hear the voice: "Flat board official, by order of the crown and the manor, come forward and declare your yields." You sigh, Stand up, brush straw off your knees, and prepare for the joyless ceremony of being inspected by someone who looks like he's never touched a hoe in his life. The tax collector cometh. He's wearing a leather vest, a woolen cloak, too nice for the weather, and a smirk that says he already knows how many chickens you've got. He's not alone. Of course, he's brought a clerk with a tally stick and a man-at-arms whose sword isn't drawn, but definitely isn't hidden either. It's less an audit and more a performance, and you're the main act. The clerk looks at your fields, your livestock, your sheds. He doesn't ask questions. He counts out loud. 3 goats, 2 pigs, 5 sheep. Noted. You smile weakly and resist the urge to point out the goat with a limp and the pig with one ear chewed off by a neighbor's dog. They don't care about condition, only quantity. This, in theory, is about fairness. Someone somewhere thought, let's send officials to ensure the peasants are paying their share and not hiding their fattened geese under haystacks. Historians still argue whether these inspections were genuinely useful or mostly performative nonsense designed to scare people into overpaying. Based on the collector's suspicious fondness for your wife's pear cake last year, you suspect it's more about cake than accuracy. You'd hoped to avoid inspection this month. There were rumors the collector had taken a sick day, which probably meant a second dinner at the Abbey. But here he is, in your yard, poking your thatch roof with a stick, as if you've hidden a silver goblet in the rafters. He approaches your grain sacks. You know they're half full. The winter was hard, the harvest worse. But that won't matter. He opens one, dips his fingers, and rubs the grain between his fingers like he's testing flour for a royal feast. Thin, he mutters. You hold your breath. Then he turns to your woodpile. There's not much there. You've burned most of it, trying to keep your aging uncle from freezing to death last month. The collector snorts. That won't do, he says, as if you could conjure trees out of spite. Sometimes these men offer leniency, but it always comes with strings. A favor owed, a bottle of cider, a daughter skilled in embroidery. Once, in the next village over, a man paid his tax in songs, played a lute until the clerk nodded and waved him off. Of course, the collector kept the lute. Today, though, you aren't so lucky. The tallyman scratches your name onto the list with a little frown. Short on grain, short on firewood, no salt, no soap. You don't even bother to argue the last 2. Soap is for feast days and funerals. What have you got? The collector asks, scanning your yard like a fox, eyeing a henhouse. You point to your beehives. Honey's good, you say quickly. New this spring. He raises an eyebrow. Show me. You lead him to the hives, carefully lift the lid, and pray the bees are in a good mood. They are mostly. One buzzes near his ear, and he flinches. That might have saved you a barrel of grain. 2 jars, he says. No less. You nod. It's half your stock, but the alternative is worse. The man-at-arms hasn't said a word. He's leaning against your fence, picking his teeth with a straw clearly bored. But you know why he's there. A reminder. You don't pay. You don't get to keep your tools, or your livestock, or your dignity. The visit ends with a scribble, a grunt, and a nod. The tax collector turns his horse. The clerk rolls up the tally sheet, and they move on to the next cottage, where someone is probably hiding a sheep in the pantry. You slump back onto your stool and listen to the hoofbeats fade. That's how it works. You don't go to the tax man. He comes to you with questions you can't answer and expectations you can't meet. He doesn't care about your sick uncle, your failing harvest, or your cracked spinning wheel. He cares about quotas. Quirky footnote. In one coastal village, collectors once demanded payment in fish until a fisherman got clever and handed over a barrel of fermented herring so vile it made the entire manor reek for a week. After that, they switched to salted cod, less poetic, much less stinky. Still, the dread lingers even after they leave. You keep glancing at the road, half expecting another visit. You recount your sacks. You pet your goat. You whisper a few curses toward the manor, soft enough that the saints won't hear. Then you go back to pulling weeds. Because the weeds don't care who owns your land. The rooster hasn't even crowed, but you're already walking toward your Lord's field, with a hoe on your shoulder and a stone in your shoe. Today's not your day to work your own land. No, today is corvée, the obligation to work the Lord's land as a form of tax. You call it what it is, time theft with blisters. The sun barely peeks over the horizon. Dew still clings to your tunic, and you're thinking about the weeds in your own garden that are definitely winning the battle this week. But instead of tending your small plot where your family eats, you're heading to a field that belongs to a man who's never harvested a thing in his life. You're not alone. There's a line of your neighbors ahead, all trudging in that same exhausted silence, each carrying tools that look more like ancestral relics than anything you'd find in a merchant's cart. No one talks much during corvée. You save your breath for the work. The steward meets you there, clipboard of the 13th century feather stuck behind his ear boots, too clean for someone who supervises field labor. He points out your row without ceremony. Plow it straight this time, he mutters, as if last time's crooked line was a moral failure instead of your ox going slightly insane halfway through. This isn't a surprise. Everyone knows how many workdays they owe each year. You've memorized yours 12 in spring, another 12 in fall, a few in winter for wood cutting, and several more for unexpected needs, which somehow always arise just when your wife's about to give birth, or your leg decides to sprain itself again. Historians still argue whether the corvée was a tolerable system or a legalized form of exploitation. Supporters say peasants were protected from eviction and got land in return. Detractors say, yes, but also ulcers. You lean toward the latter. There's a hierarchy to the misery, of course. The younger boys are tasked with running messages or scaring crows with clapping sticks. The strongest dig ditches, clear brush, and haul stones for roads that rarely seem to lead anywhere useful. The older ones, like you, get stuck with repetitive back-breaking tilling that makes your joints hum like a haunted lute. Today's task is sowing barley. You drop to your knees, plant by hand row after row, while the steward occasionally shouts at someone for spacing their seeds wrong. At one point, a cart tips over and spills manure everywhere. It's a brief moment of comedy until the steward points at you and says, "Clean it." You nod, muttering something about Saint Swithin under your breath. He's the patron saint of bad weather, but today you're hoping he also handles rude overseers. You pause only once, just before midday, to gnaw on a bit of hard cheese and stale bread that you'd forgotten in your pouch since last Tuesday. It tastes like dust and guilt. You chew slowly, watching the steward eat apples under a shady tree, and you wonder briefly, wildly, if tossing a stone in his general direction would count as a sin or a service. Payment through labor isn't limited to field work. Your cousin once paid his dues by repairing the Lord's fence, only to be fined later when the gate squeaked. Another man was tasked with catching frogs for the manor cook. For 3 weeks. You're still not sure what the frogs were for, and frankly, you don't want to know. But here's the real punchline. Even after a full day's work, you're not paid. Not in coin, not in bread, not even in vague promises. Your only reward is a slightly lighter tally mark on the steward's scroll, and the glorious privilege of going home to a field that now looks even sadder in the fading light. Some people try to skip corvée. They fake illness limp dramatically, or bribe the steward with a bottle of mead or a song. But skipping comes with risks. Miss too many days, and you'll owe extra work, or worse, be fined with grain you no longer have. The system is a net, and you are the fish who keep swimming back into it. You glance down the field. The rows stretch out in brutal symmetry, mocking your aching spine. The barley seeds glint in the sun like little coins of hope, and you realize that today your tax is buried in the dirt. Quite literally, you're sowing what you won't eat, growing what you can't claim, working a future that belongs to someone else. At sundown, the steward dismisses you with a grunt and an upward nod like he's just handed you a trophy. You lift your hoe squint at the fading sky and trudge home, mud caked to your knees and dignity trailing behind you like an old sack. Quirky aside. One manor in northern France reportedly let peasants pay off corvée with jokes if the jokes made the steward laugh hard enough. The policy lasted 1 season. Historians suspect the steward was a particularly bad audience. You arrive home to find your wife picking wild herbs and your son asleep on a sack of potatoes. You smile, because even after a day like this, the fire's still warm, and your dog still greets you like you've returned from battle, which, in a way, you have. You lie down without undressing. The earth still clings to your skin, and the ache in your back whispers of taxes already owed tomorrow. It's market day. The square is a blur of shouting merchants, squawking chickens, squinting buyers, and your neighbor shouting something about the freshness of his turnips. You're not here to shop, though. You're here to sell apples, actually. Small, red, slightly bruised, but sweet enough to tempt the right customer. You arrange them on your cart like jewels, hoping today's haul will pay for a new pair of boots and maybe even some real soap. But before you can make your first sale, a thin man in a wool tunic and an expression like someone's been lightly slapping his face all morning steps in front of your cart and coughs. Toll, he says. You nod and dig around for the copper coin you were forced to borrow from your cousin's cousin. It's scratched and smells vaguely of fish, but it will do. The man takes it, bites it. Why do they always bite it? Then drops it into a leather pouch tied to his belt like some lopsided gut. You're now officially allowed to sell apples in the King's Market. Welcome to the tangled web of medieval market taxation, where you pay for the privilege of trying to earn what you've already earned. There's a tax for everything here, a fee for setting up a stall, a toll for crossing the bridge into town, a levy on certain goods, especially luxuries like wine salt or dyed cloth. If your apples are shiny enough to catch attention, someone somewhere wants a slice of the shine. Historians still argue whether these taxes helped stimulate commerce by maintaining market order or merely squeezed peasants like overripe plums. Some claim these levies funded guards and sanitation. Others point out that sanitation was just a guy named Will who tossed hay on the muddy bits and hoped no one noticed. You hawk your apples with the practiced rhythm of someone who's done this dozens of times before. Sweet as St. Bridget's smile. 4 for a farthing 6, if you've got dimples. You say it to everyone. You say it even to people without coin. Sometimes it works. A woman stops, inspects an apple, sniffs it, frowns, and walks away. That's fine. You're used to rejection. You're used to everything being taxed before you make a profit. Just being in the square means you're part of the crown's numbers, sales counted, traders, tracked, tolls, tallied. Every coin you earn is already half promised to someone else. And if you're lucky enough to sell something fancy, you get hit again. Luxury items attract their own tolls. Imported pepper, taxed, dyed thread, taxed, a pie stuffed with goose pear and ambition, definitely taxed. You once saw a man cry after selling a pie for 1 silver coin, only to owe 2 coppers in tax, 1 to the steward and another to the church because it was St. Crispin's Day. The saint apparently loved pie. Even more galling, the church sometimes sets up its own stalls. They sell blessed items, candles, herbs, prayer tokens. No taxes, no tolls, just divine exemption. You once asked a priest how that was fair. He smiled and told you to be grateful you weren't taxed for breathing. You laughed. He didn't. Your apples begin to sell slowly. A soldier buys 3, then walks away without change. A child drops one and cries. You pretend not to see. Then a man in a feathered hat offers to buy your entire cart. You blink. This doesn't happen. Ever. But before you can celebrate, he says he'll pay in credit, scribbles something on a bit of parchment, and vanishes into the crowd. You're left holding a note that says, redeem with Thomas the Cooper, if he remembers me. You sigh, deeply. Nearby, a commotion breaks out. A merchant's been accused of underreporting his sales. The steward is arguing with him in increasingly theatrical Latin, while a crowd gathers like birds circling a dropped biscuit. You use the distraction to slide one apple to a child with big eyes and no shoes. He grins. That's worth more than a toll. By midday, you've made just enough to buy half a loaf of bread and a string of garlic. But wait, you're approached again. Second fee, says the same wool tunic man. You've passed the threshold for external trader levies. What threshold, you ask? He doesn't answer. He just holds out his hand. You want to scream. You want to pelt him with apples. Instead, you give him the last copper and mutter something about St. Lawrence's roasting fork. He doesn't even flinch. Quirky tax note. Some towns taxed laughter, seriously. In one French market, a jester's performance drew so many people that the steward declared all entertainment subject to tolls. The jester responded by telling only sad jokes for a week. The crowd left. The tax was quietly dropped. You pack up your stall as the sky darkens, not with rain, but with the dim heaviness of knowing that most of your effort today fed someone else's pocket. You've survived another market day, another dance with bureaucracy wrapped in wool and topped with smugness. Still, you walk home with fewer apples, a little bread, and the comforting knowledge that, at least for now, you're not on the steward's bad side. That's something. Until next week, when you bring pears and find out those have a fruit symmetry tax. Salt. You'd think something so small, so white, so perfectly ordinary wouldn't have the power to ruin a person's week. But in the Middle Ages, salt isn't just a seasoning, it's a luxury, a preservative, a tax magnet. And today you need some, not just for cooking, but for preserving that side of pork you've been eyeing for winter. Problem is, the salt merchant in town doesn't just sell salt. He sells salt plus duty, and the duty is nearly half the price. You arrive at his stall and pretend not to flinch when he quotes the rate. You do the mental math if you want to cure meat, keep your vegetables from spoiling, or brine your fish. You'll need salt. If you want salt, you'll need silver. If you want silver, well, you should have married a merchant. The salt tax isn't a local oddity. Across Europe, monarchs and city lords have realized that people need salt. It's the medieval version of Wi-Fi. No salt, no survival. So they tax it heavily. In France, this became the infamous gabelle, a tax so hated it stuck around for centuries and helped fuel the French Revolution. In England, it's more localized, but just as irritating. You remember an old rhyme your mother muttered? Salt and soap and silly fees cost more than butter, bread, and peas. Because, yes, soap gets taxed too. Not the fancy stuff, heaven knows you'll never afford that, but the gritty brown kind made from animal fat and ash. It stinks. It burns your eyes, but it keeps fleas away, mostly. And that apparently is worth taxing. Historians still argue whether these taxes were primarily economic levers or just creative cruelty. One camp says the revenues were essential for wars and roads. The other mutters darkly about kings and queens who smelled better than they deserved. You barter a bit, offer him 3 onions and a strip of linen to knock down the price. He shakes his head, then squints. "Is that beeswax?" he asks, nodding at the pouch at your belt. You pause. "It's not much. Just a lump you were saving to trade for a candle, but you offer it." He nods and measures out a small wooden bowl of salt. You take it and try not to cry. And it's not just salt and soap. Other necessities have surprise taxes baked in. Want to buy wine? There's a vintner's fee. Need a new cauldron. Metal goods get levied. One of your neighbors once tried to import glass from Italy. He sold his cart to pay the duty and ended up carrying the glass back in a sack. It broke. He cried. Want to bake bread and sell it? Congratulations. There's a mill tax, an oven fee, and possibly a toll on the yeast if someone notices. You once tried to bake extra loaves during harvest and sell them outside the manor walls. The steward fined you for unlicensed yeast behavior. You didn't even know that was a thing. You pass by a woman selling lavender soap wrapped in linen. She's from the nearby abbey. Nuns apparently don't pay soap taxes. Divine privilege. You wonder if joining the convent for a day might get you a discount. Then you remember you're not particularly pious, and you've already made too many sarcastic jokes about saints. Quirky sidebar. There's a legend of a village where a man tried to evade the soap tax by declaring his soap was for cows. The steward, confused and slightly horrified, let it pass, only to discover a week later that the cow soap was being sold to wealthy wives under the table. The steward fined him double. The cow was never the same. And then there's the window tax, a relatively late development, but one you've heard about from travelers. In some towns, you pay extra for the number of windows in your house. Light and air become luxuries. Some folks brick them up to avoid paying. You laugh, then look at your tiny cottage with its 2 holes and think, good call. You carry your precious salt home, careful not to spill a grain. Each bit feels like coin, like sweat, like something you shouldn't have had to give. Back home, your wife's boiling water over the fire. You hand her the salt and she smiles. You didn't get the soap. No, you say. Next week. Maybe. She nods. There's no anger, just understanding. You both know how it works. You pay a little here, a little there. And soon half your life has been taxed away in things that make the other half slightly bearable. As the fire crackles and the salted pork begins to sizzle, you lean back against the wall and close your eyes. You think about that merchant's face, about the beeswax in your pocket that's now gone, and about whether the next tax will be on firewood or air, or the way you sigh when you're tired. Maybe they'll tax that too. You're finally out of the village. Not forever, of course, just for the day. You're in town now where the streets smell less like manure and more like fish sweat, and the occasional waft of burning rosemary when someone remembers to pray. And here, the tax game changes entirely. Out on the manor, it's sacks of grain and goats with poor attitudes. But here in the bustling, muddy heart of the king's town, it's tallage. Even the word sounds like something scraped off a boot. You're technically a free tenant today because you're on town land, not your lord's. You think that might mean fewer taxes. You're wrong. It just means different taxes. In town, you don't owe the reeve, you owe the king, or the mayor, or the guild, or all three depending on how badly you've misunderstood the tiny, angry clerk who tried to explain it all last week. Tallage is a royal tax levied on towns and boroughs, sometimes without warning. One day, your stall's doing fine. The next, a man arrives with a scroll that says, everyone owes 5 shillings per chimney, or 2 goats, or the rough market equivalent thereof. Historians still argue over whether tallage was an organized revenue tool or a desperate royal cash grab. Whenever the treasury started sounding hollow, you lean toward the latter, especially since the steward collecting it last year had no idea what a chimney even was. He taxed the blacksmith twice just to be sure. You pass a line of craftsmen arguing with a tax clerk. One's holding a hammer like he might use it on paperwork. Another's shouting about how his wife already paid. The clerk looks bored, like this is the 27th identical argument of the day. It probably is. You're here to sell wool. Nothing fancy undyed, rough honest. The kind that scratches when worn and itches even after 3 boilings. But people need wool, and you need coin, or at least to avoid another week of digging drainage ditches back on the manor. But before you can even unload your bundle, a city guard appears and points at your cart. You paid the entry levy. You nod. Maybe. You think. You gave a man a coin and he stamped your thumb with berry juice. Was that real? Or did you just buy a very expensive prank? He squints at your thumb, grunts, and walks away. Crisis narrowly avoided. Then it's guild time. Oh yes, in towns trades are ruled by guilds, leatherworkers, butchers, masons, coopers, even wool merchants like you, and if you're not in the guild, you're what they politely call unregistered. What they actually call you is about to pay a fine. You explain carefully that you're not a town merchant, just a visiting peasant with some itchy wool and honest intentions. The guildmaster stares. Temporary trader's fee, he says. Then he sniffs and adds, plus a booth maintenance contribution. You hand over 2 coins and feel a part of your soul float away. You finally set up your stall between a man selling boiled eels and a woman offering pickled cabbage so potent it could be used to fumigate barns. You shout your wares. You smile. You wait. And the whole time you're aware of the many eyes on you, not customers, but assessors. They count. They write. They estimate. You sell 5 bundles. You better report 5. If you say 4 and they count 6, you're fined for fraud and dishonor and possibly forced to scrub the fishmonger's alley with a spoon. Tallage isn't just on goods, it's on space. The place you stand is taxed. The volume of your voice, not yet, but give them time. One year, the mayor's clerk tried to charge extra for shadow tax on market days based on how much sunlight your stall blocked. That lasted 3 market days before someone threw a cabbage at him, a fermented one. You overhear whispers about a new royal tax coming soon on hearths, perhaps, or ale barrels. You sigh. There is always something. The king wants to build a new wall, or a chapel, or invade France again. The money has to come from somewhere. Usually, that somewhere is the same tired crowd trying to sell wool that smells like damp sheep. Quirky side note. One town decided to levy a tallage on smiles. It was meant as a joke, a festival prank, but the steward took it seriously, collected 6 shillings, and recorded it as public cheerfulness dues. The record still exists. Historians love it. You do not. By the end of the day, you've sold enough to buy some barley and a new pot, assuming the pot seller doesn't hit you with a handle use tariff. You wrap your remaining wool and prepare to head home. Just as you reach the town gate, another clerk stops you. "Departure levy," he says flatly. You laugh. He doesn't, so you pay. Again. As you walk the long, muddy road back to your village, you think about all the money that changed hands today. Most of it didn't stay with the merchants or the peasants. It flowed upward to the guilds, the town lords, the king. It floated away like steam from a stew pot, disappearing into paperwork and scrolls with words you'll never read. But hey, at least you're not in prison. This time, you're trying to fix a hole in your roof with reeds, mud, and blind optimism when the bailiff knocks. He doesn't wait for a greeting. Just says, "You got married last spring." Yes? You nod. Then you owe the merchant. He hands you a scrap of parchment with a number scrawled on it, like it was written by someone halfway through a mug of mead. You stare at it. A marriage fee. He shrugs. Standard. You marry. You pay. Lord's right. Ah, yes. Merched. The delightful medieval tradition of taxing life milestones, because nothing says romance like a surprise fee for legally loving someone. You watch him leave, then collapse back into your thatch pile and contemplate your options. You could argue, but the last man who argued had to donate his cloak for village unity. So instead, you go inside and start counting the coins in the old jug near the hearth. You're short. Of course. You've been here before, not just with marriage. The list of life taxes in your world is longer than a cathedral sermon. Want to inherit your father's plow? Pay the relief tax. Want to hang a new window in your cottage? There's a window tax, and not just in towns. Even tiny hamlets sometimes charge for extra openings. Apparently, fresh air is a premium feature. Want to graze your pig near the stream? That's pannage. Want to cross a bridge with more than one chicken? You don't even want to know. Historians still debate whether all these petty fees were a coordinated revenue system or just a chaotic explosion of convenience taxes slapped on peasants whenever the treasury got thirsty. From where you stand on a ladder with mud in your hair, they feel like someone invented a tax for everything that might bring joy or comfort. You recall a neighbor who had to pay a fee for using the Lord's ditch to drain excess water. It was his water, but the ditch unfortunately belonged to the estate. You wonder if your cough would be taxable if it echoed across the Lord's hedgerow. And then there's Layer White, the charming fine paid by unmarried women accused of, let's say, romantic enthusiasm. It's mostly applied when someone gets pregnant outside wedlock. You'd think the father would be fined too. He's not. The system assumes he's either a noble, a ghost, or out of town. Convenient. Your sister once had to pay Layer White despite being betrothed because the wedding was scheduled not completed. That technicality cost her 3 hens and an heirloom spoon. You've also heard of Harriet, a grim little tax owed upon death. When someone dies, the Lord can claim their best beast or item, his due, they call it. You helped bury old Matty last fall. As his widow wept, the steward calmly walked away with Matty's prized ox. For the Lord, he said. May he rest well. You weren't sure if he meant Matty or the ox. Then there's the entry fee if you move to a new manor. A stranger tax. Even if you're escaping famine or marriage to someone with more teeth than charm. Welcome to your new life. Now pay for the privilege. And, perhaps, the strangest of all, a face tax. No, really. One village in central England once recorded a seasonal levy for notably visible blemishes, claiming it discouraged marriage and disrupted harmony. A man with a large mole was fined twice in 1 year. He moved to a place where the taxes made more sense, meaning they just taxed him for his boots instead. You finally find enough coin to pay your merche. Thanks to a broken pendant your wife found last spring and an old silver spoon you stole back from the steward's wife at Michaelmas. You're not proud. You're practical. You hand the coin to the bailiff who doesn't thank you. Just scribbles something and nods. You ask if that's everything. He pauses. Well, he says your chimney's a bit wide. You blink. Is that taxed? He grins. Not yet. But the council's discussing it. You shut the door before he can say another word. It's not all grim. Some folks have figured out loopholes. A widow down the road offered her tax in the form of a song, and the reeve, being deeply sentimental or just drunk, accepted. Another man claimed he couldn't pay because he was emotionally overtaxed. He still had to pay, but the steward laughed so hard he reduced the fee. Still, the principle remains. If you do something, anything, there's probably a tax attached to it. Marriage, inheritance, windows, ditches, and if rumor holds, there's talk of taxing dreams. A local monk swears he heard a bishop say, "Pleasant dreams are a form of wealth." You hope it was a joke, but this world has taxed less. As you settle in by the hearth that night, your wife, slicing turnips and humming quietly, you wonder how long it'll be before someone comes to charge you for the humming. You're doing your best to look innocent as you lead your scraggliest sheep out of the pen, half limping, half wool, all attitude, and toward the steward's paddock. It's time to pay the annual livestock tally, and there's no rule against presenting the worst animal you own, except Well, there kind of is. The steward, a man whose nose seems permanently wrinkled in suspicion, eyes the sheep and clicks his tongue. Is that the same one from last year? He asks. You pretend to mishear him and adjust your hat. It's not that you're trying to cheat. It's just that everyone else does. You're part of a long, noble tradition of medieval tax evasion, petty quiet, often ridiculous, and absolutely necessary for survival. Because the truth is, you've got a better sheep. One with thick wool, good teeth, and a temperament less likely to attack children. But if you present her, the steward marks her down as your best beast, and suddenly she's earmarked for Harriet when you die. Or she becomes the basis for next year's livestock quota. Or worse, she disappears into the Lord's stables after a clerical error. So, like everyone else, you've learned to hide the good sheep. Historians still argue how widespread peasant fraud was, and whether it was considered true rebellion or simply strategic compliance. Most records show astonishing creativity, missing cows that wandered off mysteriously, barren hens and pigs on pilgrimage. You once heard of a man who swore his donkey had become a hermit. Nobody questioned it. You've got your own methods. The good animals are kept in the back shed, hidden behind a screen of old cartwheels. The leaner ones, the tax sheep, are paraded out for inspection. You might overfeed one the night before to puff it up, rub a little soot on another's back to make it look older, or even swap animals with a cousin 2 villages over. No one tracks tags. They just eyeball and estimate. The steward makes a note and waves you off. You exhale. The good sheep is safe. But it's not just livestock. You hide other things too. Tools, extra grain surplus cloth, the better batch of ale. Anything of value is a potential liability if someone with a tally stick comes sniffing around. Your family has turned hiding things into an art form. The false bottom in the flour barrel, the hollow beam above the hearth, that suspiciously lumpy haystack in the corner of the barn. You're not alone. One local family built an entire false wall in their root cellar to conceal barrels of cider. They called it the quiet room. Another family swore their beehives were for spiritual purposes only. The priest disagreed. He took 2 jars and called it a blessing. Sometimes it's more theatrical. You remember the day old Hamnet claimed his cow had been taken by forest spirits. He told the steward he'd made peace with the fae and would accept any penalty they deemed fair. The steward, visibly unnerved, left without taxing anything. The cow reappeared 2 days later, mysteriously draped in a wreath of daisies. But these little acts of resistance come with risk. Get caught hiding a fat pig. You might lose the pig and pay a fine. Try to underreport your harvest. The steward might seize your cart. And if word spreads that you're dishonest, you could lose your place in the village rotation for shared grazing water access or the communal oven. Reputation is currency too. Still, the temptation remains, because the system doesn't feel fair. The Lord's Son rides through the village on a new horse every month. The steward wears shoes better than your wedding boots, and yet they count your chickens like you're stealing from them. So, yes, you bend the rules. You skip reporting the second batch of wool. You forget the side of smoked fish hanging in your attic. You underweigh your barley. You do it because you need to survive, because you want your children to eat, because you refuse to watch your best goat disappear into some noble stew pot. One winter, your wife hid an entire sack of dried apples inside the mattress. The steward sat on it when he came to inspect your cottage and declared it lumpy but modest. You never slept better than that season on a secret stash and a well-played trick. Quirky bit of trivia. In some regions, peasants created dummy fields, small patches of intentionally barren land near the edge of their plot, to make the real harvest look worse by comparison. From afar, it looked like your yield had failed. Up close, well, you never let them get that close. As you return home with your worst sheep, happily back in its pen unclaimed and unloved, you spot your neighbor pulling a tarp over a suspiciously large pile of something in his barn. You nod. He nods back. Neither of you says a word. The unspoken code of tax evasion hums through the village like a hymn. Everyone cheats just a little, enough to breathe, never enough to spark suspicion. A carefully calibrated dishonesty passed from generation to generation. And tonight, as you sip your slightly underreported cider and scratch the ears of your real best sheep, you think tomorrow you'll forget to mention the new chickens, just to keep the rhythm going. The bells toll in the distance, low, slow, like a warning or a prayer, depending on how you hear it. You sit on your doorstep, bowl of thin stew in hand, and stare out at the village green, now quieter than you've ever seen it. No children playing, no pigs rooting, just wind dirt and the whisper that death is near again. The plague has returned. You survived the last wave. Barely. Your uncle didn't. Neither did half the village. One morning, there were 22 households here. By the end of the season, only 9 still had smoke rising from their chimneys. But now, it's not the disease itself that tightens your throat. It's the tax man. Because while death takes away neighbors, the crown only sees empty hands, hands that once paid, worked, served, and now lie still. And that means the rest of you must pay more. Taxes don't die. They just shift. You remember the first time it happened? The burial carts hadn't even stopped rolling when a messenger arrived from the Lord's manor, politely informing everyone that due to the reduced productivity of the estate, the remaining tenants would need to cover the shortfall. The steward called it rebalancing. You called it cruel arithmetic. Historians still argue whether these increases were born of true desperation, lords facing ruin without labor, or whether it was just the powerful squeezing the vulnerable under the guise of necessity. You suspect a bit of both. After all, someone's manor was recently rebuilt with stone. Yours still leaks when it rains. Today, you're expected to pay double what you did last year, more grain, more labor, more eggs, even though your flock is down to 5 chickens and a rooster, who seems to be mourning too. The logic is simple. Fewer people, same obligations. And obligations like weeds don't go away just because you're grieving. You've heard of towns where the tax collectors started taking furniture, not fancy chests or golden goblets, real peasant furniture. Benches, barrels, copper pots. One widow traded her husband's boots to cover the late harvest levy. Another man offered a painted icon of St. Cuthbert. The steward took it, muttered something about poor craftsmanship, and marked him settled. Quirky tale. One coastal village decimated by the plague, placed scarecrows dressed in ragged cloaks around empty homes to convince the tax agents that residents were just out fishing. It worked for a while until a dog tore one down mid-inspection. After that, the steward demanded triple tolls for deception and puppeteering. You glance toward your neighbor's house. It's still boarded up. She left weeks ago, fleeing to a monastery with her youngest son. No one's heard from her since. Yet her name is still on the tax roll. The steward asked you if you'd cover her fee. You said no. He frowned. You're expecting a penalty notice by week's end. And it's not just manorial taxes. The church hasn't lightened its hand either. Tithes are still due, even from the sick, even from the dead. You heard a priest demand a final tithe from a man who hadn't spoken in days. The family handed over a single withered onion. The priest sighed and blessed it anyway. You're not heartless. You understand that roads must be maintained, grain stored, fields watched. But there's something bitter in the air now beyond the plague. A sense that the system cares less about survival than it does about the illusion of order. As long as the scrolls are balanced, no one asks how many graves are new. There's a shift in the village, too. Quiet resistance. People delay payments longer. They barter more. A group of men started meeting at night in the back of the smithy, whispering about collective refusal. You haven't joined them yet, but you listen. Meanwhile, the tax burdens keep coming now with interest. One steward suggested raising livestock taxes because fewer animals means each one is more valuable. That's like doubling the toll on a bridge because half of it collapsed. You wonder if logic is taxed too. One clerk had the audacity to suggest a plague levy as if death itself owed rent. The council nodded. It's unclear whether they were serious. You didn't laugh. Tonight, as you scrape the bottom of your bowl and stare at the stars, you hear another cart in the distance. A heavy one, probably carrying grain to the manor or bodies to the hill. Your wife joins you on the step, wrapping her shawl tighter. She doesn't speak. Neither do you. There's nothing left to say. The plague has taken your neighbors. The tax will take what's left of them. And tomorrow you'll hand over 3 sacks of barley and a coil of rope and hope that no one asks for your best chicken or your dignity. You're standing outside the chapel again. Same time every week. Same tired basket in hand. Inside, the priest is chanting in Latin, and outside you're paying more. Because apparently tithes weren't quite enough. You thought you understood the church taxes. 1/10 of your grain, sure, the occasional jar of honey fine. But now you're being asked for Peter's pence again, and Easter offerings, and a voluntary Lent donation that somehow got your name scratched off the blessing list last spring when you forgot. It's exhausting. Holy, maybe, but exhausting. Peter's pence is one of those charming traditions passed down from earlier centuries where every household owed a penny to Rome once a year. It sounds manageable. It would be manageable if the priest didn't insist on collecting it during a famine. This year, the penny comes with a reminder that failing to pay might cause delays in the redemption of your sins. A neat trick, that. Historians still argue whether Peter's pence was ever truly voluntary in the medieval mind. Some say it was symbolic, a gesture of unity with the wider church. Others point to records of fines for forgetfulness and suspect it was just as mandatory as everything else, only dressed in incense and guilt. You hand over a cheese wheel today, your last. It's soft, a little crumbly, and maybe slightly more aromatic than the saints would prefer. But the priest smiles, blesses it, and tells you he'll say a prayer for your aging father. You nod, thank him, and try not to wonder whether that prayer will actually happen or if it's just been traded for a slice of ecclesiastical lunch. And there's more. Oh, there's always more. When your cousin died, the family paid a mortuary fee, essentially a tax on dying. His best coat was claimed by the church, folded solemnly, and laid on the altar. You saw the vicar wear it 2 weeks later during Mass. No one mentioned it. Everyone noticed. Then there's the baptismal tax. When your second daughter was born, you couldn't afford the full fee. The priest frowned, sprinkled her with less enthusiasm than usual, and mumbled the blessing. You joked later that maybe she'd grow up half holy. Your wife didn't laugh. You've learned to prepare for these things. A basket of eggs kept ready for holy days. A pouch of herbs dried and bundled in case the priest needs offerings for the abbey's sick room. Some days you wonder if the church keeps a longer list of dues than the manor, but questioning it feels risky, dangerous even. The church isn't just a tax collector, it's salvation, or so they say. To refuse is to risk more than fines. It's to be left off the Mass intentions, to be excluded from holy burial, to have your name whispered with suspicion. Still, you've seen murmurs of defiance. A family in a neighboring hamlet refused to pay their Lent tithe. The father claimed St. Jerome appeared in a dream and told him God already has enough goats. They were excommunicated for a season, but eventually forgiven after donating 3 jars of honey and a goose. And don't forget, church repairs. A few winters ago, the steeple cracked. The entire village was asked for support, not demanded, of course. just strongly suggested. By name, in public, during Mass. You donated half a sack of barley and a promise to help thatch the priest's roof. You've never been invited to dinner. There's even a tale of a poor widow who sewed a new altar cloth from her daughter's wedding dress to avoid payment. The priest wept. The steward clapped. The cloth is still there, though you suspect no one remembers the sacrifice, only the stitching. You've considered joining a different parish, but that would mean paying entry dues there, plus explaining why you left. And if your former priest holds a grudge, he might write to the bishop. And then the fees get really spiritual. Quirky note. One monastery reportedly began accepting jokes as tithes from minstrels, so long as the punchlines were edifying. It didn't last. Too many jokes about friars and wine. The abbot declared laughter a distraction and doubled the candle tax instead. As you walk home from the chapel today, your basket empty. Your heart is heavy, but oddly resigned. You've paid your dues, for now. The blessings might follow, or they might not. That's the game. Your daughter meets you at the path, holding a broken doll. You sit with her, patch the head with twine, and think about all the invisible things you've paid for this month. Blessings, prayers, forgiveness, eternal light, and maybe, just maybe, some peace. The roll arrives on a cart, pulled by 2 sweating oxen, creaking under its own weight, guarded by 2 armed men and a clerk who looks like he hasn't blinked since Easter. You gather with the rest of the villagers around the manor steps, squinting at the sunlight bouncing off the enormous sheepskin scroll, unfurling like a slow accusation. The clerk clears his throat. The tax roll. He says it like it's a blessing. It's not. The tax roll is the official record of what you owe every name, every field, every sheep, every suspiciously absent pig. It's where reality meets parchment and is promptly twisted into something both terrifying and eerily permanent. You step forward when your name is called. The clerk doesn't look up as he reads 3 hens, 1 sack of barley, 4 days of labor, and he pauses. You failed to provide kindling for the manor bakehouse. That's an added day of ditch work. You open your mouth to protest because you did deliver kindling just in the wrong-sized bundle. The steward had said nothing. Apparently, parchment says otherwise. You nod. What else can you do? This is what the Domesday Book taught the kingdom, that everyone could be measured, counted, and taxed. Though that great survey happened long before your time, its spirit remains. The tax roll doesn't forget, and worse, it's copied. One version stays in the manor, another goes to the reeve, a third might end up in the lord's estate across the country. You can't outrun ink. Historians still argue whether this bureaucratic surge made life more organized or just more oppressive. The nobles say it brings clarity. The peasants say it brings headaches and more line items every year. Your neighbor leans in and whispers, "They spelled your name wrong." You glance at the scroll. They did. 1 letter off. Enough that on paper, you're now someone else. For a fleeting moment you consider pretending to be that someone. Maybe they owe less. Maybe they don't exist. But the clerk knows your face. You remember last year when old Evo tried to claim he was his cousin. He's dead, said the clerk. Exactly, said Evo. The steward fined him for insolence and took his scythe. Still there's power in names, in what's written and what isn't. A woman once had her cow erased from the roll by seducing the steward's apprentice, or so she claimed. The cow reappeared the next season fatter than before, with no explanation and no tax record. Legend status, really. Some try to bribe the clerks. A bag of apples here, a cask of beer there. It works sometimes. But others find themselves paying twice, once in gifts again on the scroll. Paper is greedy like that. You once tried to appeal your entry, brought your wife, your children, even the priest, made your case with trembling hands and hope. The clerk listened, nodded, then wrote complains too much in the margin. You've never spoken during roll call again. And yet the roll isn't just a ledger, it's a weapon. It can be used to accuse, exclude, or elevate. You've seen neighbors disappear from it entirely. Moved, they say. Died. Taken to serve. But their land is still there. Their debts reassigned. You also remember the day the steward read off a man's dues, and the amount had doubled because his name had been copied wrong on purpose. He didn't argue, just handed over his best goose and muttered something about St. Judas. Quirky footnote. One scribe in York, bored out of his mind, began inserting tiny animal sketches between names. Cats, mostly. Once a pig with wings. No one noticed for years. When they did, the page was removed, burned, and the scribe reassigned to ditch tallying. The cats, however, live on in rumor. You notice your son watching the scroll with wide eyes. To him, it must seem like magic. A giant list that decides who starves, who works, who gets to keep their shoes. You kneel beside him and whisper, if you ever learn to write, never trust what you read. He nods, though you're not sure he understands. The roll keeps rolling. Names blur together. Each one met with a groan, a sigh, a muttered curse. And somewhere in the clerk's careful notes is your year written in ink and obligation, a neat box of barley hens and days of labor. No mention of your wife's illness. No note about the wolves taking 2 sheep. Just entries. Cold, clean, final. You walk home that evening with the soft crinkle of parchment still ringing in your ears. You pass a friend who was taxed for a well that dried up 3 years ago. He shrugs. It's still on the roll, he says. That night you dream of being left off the scroll, of slipping quietly from the ink into blank space. No name, no debt, no tally. Just freedom. You wake up smiling. Then you remember you owe a day of ditch work for kindling that wasn't quite kindling enough. The tavern is full tonight, full of muddy boots, clinking mugs, tired eyes, and low, dangerous murmurs. You nurse your pint of weak ale like it's holy water, and keep your ears open. The fire crackles, smoke hangs just beneath the rafters, and someone in the corner is strumming a lute that's missing two strings and any sense of rhythm. But the music's not what matters. It's the talk. Taxes, again. Always taxes. You hear the usual complaints? This year's tolls are higher. The steward added a new fee for late sunrise labor, and someone's cow was taxed twice for being pregnant. But tonight the mood is darker. Jokes land with sharp edges. Voices drop to whispers, and someone says the words everyone's been thinking for months. Enough. You lean closer, careful not to draw attention. The speaker is a man named Jory, leather-faced, sharp-eyed, a tenant farmer from the edge of the village. He's not known for subtlety or sobriety, but tonight he's stone-cold serious. They say in Kent Jory mutters they've stopped paying altogether, locked the taxman in the stocks, sent the bailiff home with a black eye. Someone laughs. It's nervous. Swear it, Jory insists. They say they're organizing, not just grumbling, acting. You sip your ale and try not to show what you're thinking. That sounds like suicide, or maybe salvation. Hard to tell in this light. Historians still debate how widespread tavern talk like this was in the years leading up to revolts like the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Some believe these whispers were isolated and futile. Others argue they were the fuel, the kindling, the spark that turned into flame. You've heard the stories Wat Tyler leading thousands through London, demanding justice. Men who once paid quietly, suddenly shouting for freedom, for lower rents, for the end of poll taxes, for the right to live without fear of parchment and sword. Of course it ended badly. That's what they say. Tyler was killed. The promises were broken. But the idea didn't die. And here now in this smoky tavern, filled with poor ale and poorer peasants, that idea stirs again. I heard another voice says this one, softer, younger female, that in Norwich they burned the tax books. Someone swears under their breath, not out of anger, but awe. You watch the room. Some nod. Some shake their heads. A few pretend not to listen, suddenly fascinated by their bread crusts. One man, gray-bearded, pockmarked, leans back and says, "The taxes are the only thing keeping the manor upright. You burn the books, you bring down the roof, and it lands on us." It's a fair point. You know the system is fragile, but it's also relentless. Taxes don't just take your grain, they take your time, your energy, your children's futures. And sometimes talk like this feels less like rebellion and more like survival. You remember when your cousin tried to organize a refusal day. Everyone was supposed to withhold their grain dues for just 1 week. It lasted 3 days. The reeve arrived backed by 2 knights and took his cow and his cart and his dignity. But now the numbers feel different, more angry, more tired. There's strength in shared frustration, a rising tide of no more. Quirky historical aside, one village tried to negotiate with their tax collector by writing a formal letter on pigskin parchment, sealed with beeswax and goose feathers. It read in full, "We have nothing left to give. Try the saints. They eat better." The letter was ignored, but the pigs were not. They were confiscated. Back in the tavern, the air has shifted. The fire burns lower. Jory leans across the table. "You with us?" he asks. You hesitate. Your fingers trace the rim of your mug. You think of your wife, your children, your aching back, your empty barn, and then you think of the clerk, the roll, the taxes on your windows, your boots, your soul. You nod. Nothing loud. Just once. But it's enough. You leave the tavern quietly, heart pounding. The night air is cold, but you feel hot. Like something's begun. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's just talk, but it's different this time. It feels different. Tomorrow the steward will walk through the village reading from a new scroll. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, you dream not of taxes, but of fire. You wake to shouting. It's early, too early, but the voices outside your cottage are urgent, sharp, and rising. You pull on your boots, heart already racing, and step into the morning mist to find the green packed with people, neighbors, friends, strangers, and at the center of it all, a man with wild eyes and muddy boots stands on an overturned cart, shouting so loud his voice cracks. We've given all we can. Now they want our sons. You push forward through the crowd. A parchment flutters in his hand, official, red-waxed, cruel in its neatness. It's a new decree from the manor, or maybe from the crown itself. A poll tax, 1 shilling per person, every man, woman, and child over 15. No exceptions. Your mouth goes dry. That's more than a season's savings. It's more than you can pay. It's more than anyone here can pay. The crowd murmurs, rage, fear, disbelief. You hear someone say, even the children, and someone else answer, especially the children. Historians agree the poll taxes of the late 14th century pushed many communities to the brink. Flat fees, regardless of wealth, turned simmering resentment into boiling fury. And here now you feel that heat rising. An old woman with knotted hands holds up an empty purse. I've buried 3 husbands, fed 6 children on cabbage and curses, and now they want more, she croaks. No one laughs. You feel it happening, something snapping. The kindling that's been gathering for years from the tallymen, the tithes, the merchet, and the mystery fees for lane wear and tear. It's all igniting right here in the muddy heart of the village. Jory's here. Of course he is. He moves through the crowd, quiet but magnetic. You lock eyes. He doesn't speak, he just nods. A shared understanding. Then someone throws the parchment into the fire. It's not dramatic. It doesn't explode. It just curls, blackens, and turns to ash. But the silence that follows is louder than any bell. That was the moment. You see it on their faces, the fear of punishment cracking just enough to let the light of possibility through. Someone kicks over the steward's collection box. Another breaks the manor gate with a shovel. There's no plan, not yet, just years of exhaustion finding a voice. The manor steward appears, red-faced, shouting about treason, fines, gallows, but no one listens, not today. You join the others as they march to the manor storehouse. Grain meant for taxes is redistributed. Barrels of ale are rolled down the hill like triumphant thunder. The steward flees. The tax roll. Burned. A great cheer rises raw and uncertain and full of something new power. You never imagined being part of a revolt. You always thought rebellion was for stories, for faraway cities and bold knights. But here you are holding a pitchfork with blistered hands and shaking arms, standing beside your neighbors, not asking for fairness, demanding it. Quirky tale. In one town, the peasants stormed the tax office and declared the village free. Then immediately elected the town baker as their leader because he had the biggest house and a really loud voice. It lasted 4 days, but those 4 days live on in ballads. Back in your village, things move fast. The manor is stripped of its records. The clerks are sent home minus their scrolls. Someone climbs the church bell tower and rings it not for mass, but for the people. You stand beneath it, unsure if you're scared, proud, or both. And then, a pause. The shouting fades. The flames flicker low. People return to their homes, eyes wide, hearts pounding. No one knows what comes next. You sit in your cottage that night, fingers still trembling. Your wife bandages your palm. Your daughter offers you a bit of cold bread. Outside, the village is quiet again, but it's a different quiet. Not the silence of submission. The silence before something larger. Will there be retaliation? Likely. Will the lords come? Almost certainly. But for this one day, the tallyman was powerless. The scrolls were ashes, and the tax collector went home empty-handed. And you felt free. You returned to the fields, days after the revolt, expecting retribution to fall from the sky like arrows or coins or curses. But the sky is empty. Blue, uninterested. The steward is gone. The manor gate hangs half open. The tallyman hasn't returned. For the first time in years, no one is counting your chickens literally or metaphorically. You walk past the granary and resist the urge to look over your shoulder. It feels wrong, this sudden absence of scrutiny, like someone forgot to turn the world back on. But it doesn't last. By week's end, a messenger arrives. He wears the king's badge and a look of faint disgust, like he's smelled something sour since breakfast. He doesn't ride into the village. He delivers his message from the edge, hands it to the priest, and leaves without a word. It's a decree, royal, sealed. Everyone gathers to hear it read. All dues are to resume immediately. Any village found withholding taxes, damaging official property, or tampering with roll records shall be fined at triple rate and remanded into custody of the crown's men. So, there it is, The quiet was just a breath between sentences. Historians still argue whether rebellions like yours actually changed anything. Some say they were crushed and forgotten. Others insist they laid the groundwork for future rights reforms revolutions. You wonder if maybe both are true. That progress can die and still leave behind seeds. The priest voice trembling finishes the decree. No one claps. No one curses. There is just pause, the kind that stretches long and slow and uncertain, like the moment before a pot finally boils over. Jory speaks first. Triple rate, he scoffs. On what? My grief. My empty barn. Someone laughs, short and bitter. Then someone else adds, let them come. My door's already open. You don't speak. You don't need to. Your silence is part of the chorus now. The king's men do come eventually. Not in armies, just a few armed riders sent to collect names and coin. They take a few things, ask a few questions, but they don't linger. The rebellion has cooled into compliance, but the flame remains beneath the surface. And it's not just your village. Stories trickle in from beyond the hills, towns that refused entry to taxmen, peasants who formed councils' fields declared free for all. Not all survived the backlash, but some did. And the officials, so thorough last year, seem less confident now. You pay your taxes again. Not all, not right away, but enough to stay safe. And yet, something has changed. The steward no longer walks through the village with his chest puffed. The clerks glance up when you enter the hall. Even the priest has stopped offering his sermons on divine order quite so loudly. You remember the steward's face during the revolt, pale, wide-eyed, vulnerable. You'd never seen him look at peasants before. Not really. That night he did. That might be worth something. You're careful now, cautious, but not the same. And neither is your village. People share more. Tools, grain, news. When the clerk forgets a name on the new roll, no one reminds him. When the taxman stumbles in the mud, no one offers a hand. It's subtle, this resistance, but it spreads. Quirky aftermath. One village put on a play mocking their steward with a puppet named Lord Longnose, who demanded taxes for every sneeze. The steward complained to the bishop. The bishop laughed and asked if he could borrow the puppet for Lent. You pass by the old tax roll, one day restored, recopied, pinned on the manor wall. You see your name, your dues, but beside them scribbled in tiny script, delayed, due to unrest. You trace the words with your finger. You're not proud, not exactly, but you're awake now. The world is still heavy with fees and duties and the ever-growing weight of parchment. But now when they read your name, you don't lower your head. You look them in the eye. Because once for one bright moment, you weren't just a name on a roll. You were the reason the ink paused. You find yourself standing just outside the manor hall again. Not by choice, never by choice, but because your wife insists you follow up on the inheritance claim from her brother's death. He left a small plot, 2 goats and a rake that no longer rakes. But in this world, Even a broken rake is taxable. You clutch the crumpled parchment that the scribe wrote last week and step inside. The air smells like damp wool candle wax and the faint panic of people trying to look more important than they are. At the long table near the hearth, a clerk waves you forward without looking up. Widow's dues, he mumbles, reading from the roll. You start to explain that you're not the widow, just the husband of the sister of the man who, but the clerk raises a hand. It doesn't matter. There's a fee. Of course there is. The widow's tax, sometimes called Harriet, for the living, is a charming little tradition where women, especially unmarried or widowed, owe extra payments when they inherit or retain property. It's not official in every village, but around here, if a woman gets anything other than scorn and extra work, someone decides she should pay for it. You hand over what you have, a skein of wool, 2 wax candles, and half a jar of pickled onions. The clerk eyes the onions, sniffs once, then grunts approval. Next. And just like that, your brother-in-law's goats are yours. Sort of. Temporarily. Until someone finds a better claim, or the next tax roll adds a new fee for recent livestock assumption. Historians still debate how women were taxed in the Middle Ages. Some argue they were spared certain dues due to their social position. Others point out the mountain of evidence suggesting women were simply taxed differently through fees, masked as customs expectations or carefully worded punishments. Your wife, for instance, was once fined for selling cloth on a feast day. Never mind that the cloth was woven by her hands and the feast was for a saint no one could name. She paid with herbs. The steward took her rosemary and complained it lacked pious scent. You remember when old Agnes passed away? She had no sons, only a niece. The manor seized the cottage anyway, claiming it reverted to the lord by default. The niece moved into a lean-to beside the sheep pen and now pays rent for the privilege of not freezing to death. There's another fee called child white, a fine for women who bear children out of wedlock. You've seen it levied, even when everyone knew the father was a traveling knight with a fondness for disappearing before sunrise. The woman pays. The night rides on. And yet women often become the economic glue of these villages, brewing, spinning, midwifing, tending gardens, managing animals. They know the barter rates by heart. They know which priest accepts extra eggs instead of coin. They know how to pay without seeming to pay. Quirky bit. In one town, a group of widows formed a kind of tax collective, pooling goods and trading labor to cover each other's fees. They called themselves the Blessed Spinners, and even had a secret code sewn into the hems of their garments. A steward caught on and tried to break it up. He ended up with a tunic full of fleas and a mysteriously spoiled cask of wine. No one confessed. Back in your cottage, your wife greets you with a look that says, "Well," you show her the receipt, a smudged mark on thin parchment, and she nods. She doesn't thank you. She knows what it cost, not the onions, the dignity. Later that night, she tells you the priest came by. asked for a little something extra for her Easter tithe. She gave him a nettle pie and told him to meditate on humility. You laugh until your sides ache. Still the burden persists. She pays in coin and goods in silence. She hides the good yarn and sells the coarse stuff. She pretends not to understand when the steward mutters about extra dues for fine shoes. She wears her boots until they crack. She refuses to shrink. And you try to carry your share, knowing full well she's carrying hers and half of yours besides. You once joked that if women ran the tax office, everything would be more organized and far less tolerated. Your wife said if women ran the tax office, we'd make the Lord's pay. You think she meant it. You're kneeling in the dirt beside the churchyard wall, digging for onions you planted months ago and nearly forgot about because surviving medieval taxation means forgetting just enough to keep moving, but remembering just enough to not starve. As you pry up a stubborn bulb, you hear a voice float over the hedge. And of course, the monks don't pay a thing. You freeze. Not because it's untrue, but because you weren't supposed to say it out loud. But the man on the other side, a merchant from the next town over, judging by the jingling coins and 2 clean boots, isn't wrong. The monastery up the hill looms over your village like a quiet stone-bellied giant, beautiful, peaceful, and economically invisible. The monks live well, and they pay nothing. You've known it for years, of course. Everyone has. The church, especially in its monastic form, enjoys a kind of celestial immunity. No labor dues, no hearth taxes, no tithes, because they receive them, and no tallage ever. Historians still debate the full scope of monastic exemptions. Some argue they were justified by the church's social services, shelter, healing, education. Others point to tax records so blank they may as well have been illuminated manuscripts of silence. Your cousin once worked in the monastery gardens. He said the monks had 2 kinds of fields, visible ones where they planted barley and sang psalms, and other fields tucked behind stone walls where they grew rare herbs sold to nobles tax-free. Sanctified commerce, the abbot called it. Your cousin called it a miracle of accounting. You stand now wiping dirt from your hands and look up toward the abbey spire. At dusk, its bell tolls gently like a lullaby for the overworked. You've paid your salt tax, your wool tax, your funeral dues. The monks, they ring a bell, bake a loaf, and receive free flour. You know because you delivered it twice. Still, it's hard to resent them fully. Some are kind. They treat the sick, feed the hungry. You once brought your feverish son to Brother Thomas, who laid cool cloths on his head and whispered prayers for hours. He never asked for payment. Just a few eggs if you had them. But not all monks are saints. You remember the time the abbot fined a shepherd for grazing too close to God's hedges. No one could agree where those hedges began or even what made them holy. The fine stuck. The sheep, tragically, did not. Then there's the issue of sanctuary. More than once you've seen men flee tax agents by running into the monastery. If they made it across the threshold before the steward's boots, they were safe, at least for a time. Some stayed for weeks pretending to sweep cloisters or study scripture while their debts cooled just enough to negotiate. One man, accused of owing 3 pigs' worth of labor, entered the monastery as a lay brother. He now tends bees, sings poorly, and refuses to discuss pigs. "I've renounced swine," he says. The steward avoids eye contact when they cross paths. You once asked Brother Matthew if monks ever felt guilty about their immunity. He smiled gently and said, "Our burden is different. We pray for you." You wanted to ask if prayer paid taxes, but you were holding a borrowed Bible at the time and thought better of it. Quirky tale. A monastery in the north once declared its cows divine instruments and refused to pay herd levies. When the steward threatened seizure, the monks painted halos on all the cows and staged a procession. The steward fled. The cows remained. Back in the village, the talk continues. Some scoff, some joke. A few admire the monk's cleverness, but no one does anything. Because challenging the church's privileges feels like playing dice with thunderclouds. Still the whisper grows, "Why them and not us?" You head home with your onions, mind spinning. You're not foolish enough to challenge the monks, not openly. But something about this feels heavier now. The fields, the taxes, the silence of cloistered exemption. It sticks to your ribs like undercooked porridge. Later that night, your wife lights a tallow lamp, the one the church gave you last Advent. You sit beside it, peeling onions, watching the shadows dance like monks in procession. Maybe one day your son will read Latin, wear robes, live in a stone building where the taxman doesn't knock. Or maybe he'll kneel in the same dirt you did today, wondering why God needs so many onions. You're at the edge of the village again, where the road to the old cemetery begins. Not because anyone died today, but because someone died last week, and the steward has finally come to collect what he calls the final account. You shift uncomfortably in your boots as he inspects the modest hut the deceased left behind. He walks slowly, almost reverently, but not out of respect. He's inventorying, estimating, taking mental notes on what can be claimed. You already know what's coming, the death duties. They never forget. You and the other villagers call it Harriet, or the price of dying poor. The Lord calls it custom. When a tenant dies, his best beast, best garment, or best tool passes to the Lord payment for the land the deceased once held. Never mind that he worked it for 30 years. Never mind that his widow is now alone with 2 small children and a single sickly goat. The steward emerges, holding a battered spade and a leather pouch. This, he says, will do. The widow nods without speaking. Her eyes are dry. She wept earlier when the body was laid into the ground without a priest because they couldn't afford the burial fee on top of the Harriet. You buried him yourself, quietly, just before dusk. Historians argue whether death duties were fair in exchange for the privilege of tenancy, or whether they were simply feudal scavenging dressed in tradition. But out here, fairness isn't part of the vocabulary, only expectation. Sometimes the payment is literal: a pig, a cart, a cooking pot. Other times, it's symbolic. One woman gave up her late husband's shoes, worn, thin, patched, twice sacred to her, for reasons no Lord would ever understand. The steward took them. He laughed at their size. You help the widow carry her water back to the hut, and she thanks you with half a cabbage and a sad smile. He didn't even own much, she says. And still they wanted part of it. You nod. Because that's how it works. Even after death, they keep collecting. It's not just the manor. The church has its own claims: a mortuary fee, a burial tax, a small offering for eternal peace. You once saw a priest pause mid-funeral to ask if the family had remembered to pay for candle lighting. They hadn't. The candles stayed unlit. One legend says there's a village where the dead are buried with a single coin in the mouth, not for passage into the next life, but in case the steward tries to tax the bones. Probably not true, but it feels plausible. And not all stewards are greedy. Some quietly waive the fee if the family's particularly poor, or if the dead was beloved. But even then, it's mercy, not policy. The roll doesn't care. It lists debts, not grief. Quirky story. A miller once tricked the steward by burying his best plow under the hearth, then claiming it had been taken by angels. The steward, unwilling to pry up floorboards, accepted a cracked mug instead. The plow stayed hidden for 10 years. When it was finally unearthed, it still had a faint smell of smoke and spite. Back in your cottage, you sit by the fire, watching the coals pulse like embers of every tax you've ever paid. Your wife says nothing. She's thinking of her parents, of what will be taken, of how your own name will be crossed off the roll one day, not erased, just annotated with a fee. You wonder what they'll take from you. Maybe your boots, maybe your hoe, maybe the spoon your daughter carved for your birthday, the one with a crooked handle and heart scratched into the side. You hope it's not the spoon, but more than that, you hope someone will remember you beyond what you owed, beyond what was claimed, that someone will say, he worked hard, or he paid what he could, or maybe just he laughed sometimes, even when the stewards came. You lie back staring at the rafters and listen to the night wind press against the shutters, like a hand looking for something to claim. You know tomorrow you'll wake again, put your hands in the soil, and do what needs doing. Because the land doesn't wait, and neither does the taxman. But tonight, for just this moment, there are no dues, no rolls, no scribes, no footsteps on the path. Just you, your family, and the quiet hum of having, at least for now, nothing left to give. The fire burns low now. The village is asleep. You're still finally, still in a world that never stops demanding, weighing, tallying. The sounds of labor, of tolling bells and clinking coin, have faded into the soft chorus of night insects and creaking beams overhead. It's peaceful, not because anything changed, but because you've carved out one breath between seasons, between payments, between the knocking of the next collector. You feel the weight of what came before, names scratched into rolls, lives measured by sacks and sheaves, taxes that followed people into their dreams and haunted their children's tables. But you also feel something else, resilience. All those who found a way, who offered turnips instead of silver, who hid the best sheep, who sang a joke to dodge a fee, who shared bread when the steward took the grain, who didn't give up not because they believed the system was fair, but because they knew it wasn't and still kept going. You stretch your legs, let the last of the warmth from the hearth soak into your bones. The world is quiet now, and though the taxes will return and the roll will grow longer, you've earned this stillness, this pause, this peace. Let your eyes grow heavy. Let the village fade behind your thoughts. Let the tallyman drift into distant dreams where scrolls unravel forever and no one is writing. You've done enough for today. Rest now. Tomorrow the field will be waiting.